Hi, welcome to the American Helicopter Museum and Education Center. My name is Bob Beggs, and I'm the chairman of the board of the museum. And I'm here to welcome you. So, as we noted, there are a lot of teachers. How many teachers in the room are kind of science and technology teachers? Nice, outstanding. So you're gonna get some science and technology today. How about history teachers? All right, we're gonna have plenty of history today. What's left? Gym teachers. No phys ed? Oh, yeah, we got some phys ed. Excellent. All right. Well, listen, the American Helicopter Museum and Education Center has, opened back in 1994, and we serve over 35,000 visitors annually. There's a lot going on here. It's a place for kids. In fact, our primary demographic is school children. We're all about sharing the magic of vertical flight with folks that come here. A lot on the schedule today. One of the things I do want to suggest as you break for lunch, since you're going to be sitting most of the day, that's going to be an opportunity to walk around the museum, grab your lunch, go out to the picnic tables, or I'll be giving tours of the museum. So those that want to walk around and understand about these helicopters, the history of these, myself or some of the other docents will be able to give you those tours, and you can ask questions about the museum. Also, on your way out today, the museum would be pleased if you would take a copy of George Townsend's book, Autogyro, The Story of the Windmill Plane. They're out at the table. That's a free gift to you from the museum. We really thank you for being here. We're excited about the day. And let me introduce Mr. Walter McDougall, who is the co-chair of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, History Institute for Teachers. Okay? Walter, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beggs. I indeed am Walter McDougall, professor of history and also the Alloy Anson Professor of International Relations at the University of Pennsylvania. But I'm here in my capacity as the co-chair of FPRI's History Institute for Secondary School Teachers. It's my privilege to be the one to welcome you to this special institute the FPRI is putting on, an institute on a fascinating case study of technology and innovation. It's special, but I hope it won't remain special, because I would love to see this particular day become a kind of a prototype for future investigations into innovation and the teaching of innovation in the future. We owe this still special event, however, to a number of institutions and people whom I hasten to thank. First and foremost, of course, our host, the American Helicopter Museum, Mr. Beggs, and our supporters, the Piasecki Foundation and the Boeing Corporation, and our impresario, Lawrence Husick. And not least, I want to thank personally all of you in attendance. As a parent of a high schooler and as a professor who teaches former high schoolers, I appreciate, perhaps more than most, what I call your quiet heroism in the classroom, teaching American children despite all of the distractions and resistance put in your way. So I thank you, teachers. I'm delighted to have you here. I also want to welcome FPRI trustees, I see some, as well as friends and staff of the Foreign Policy Research Institute and other distinguished guests of Boeing Corporation and the museum. Now, I myself am delighted to open these proceedings for, in addition to what I've already said, for three other reasons. First of all, I am just old enough to have grown up with helicopters. I was even a loyal viewer of Whirlybirds, a 30-minute television program that was on the air from 1957 to 1960. It featured Bell 47s, for those of you who don't remember it. I also am someone whose favorite segment in the weekly episode of MASH was the melancholy opening scene with its Bell H-13 Sioux Medevac choppers. I have become, a second reason is that I myself became a helicopter passenger, a real fan of the helicopter experience while serving with the United States Army Artillery in the Vietnam War. We were flown around in and out of various LZs and fire bases in the jungle by CH-47 Chinooks. I loved them. I much preferred traveling around Vietnam by helicopter, even though you're just above the tree line and all that, than I did in fixed-wing aircraft. It scared the dickens out of me, landing on those little airstrips. And I even brought with me a couple of props today. To prove my point, some of you old-timers may recognize this. Oh, yes, this is your basic cargo strap off a Chinook, which we all larcenous GIs would steal and then cut off to make belts. Very nice souvenir belt. I also have a prop that was given to me by a very important person at the Boeing plant here locally. So I have my heat. I wore this summer on my annual golf trip to New Hampshire. We're visiting my brother. He has a good friend, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Benoit, who commanded a battalion in Vietnam and flew his lead Cobra in gunship operations in Vietnam. He got a kick out of this when I wore it up there to play golf this summer. The third reason, however, and this is perhaps most pertinent, long ago I was fortunate to write a book that won a prize. The Dexter Prize, it was called then, after the Dexter Chemical Company. Its name has now been changed to the Edelstein Prize after the CEO of that company. Oh yes, I also won a prize called the Pulitzer, but I valued the Dexter Prize that I won for the book called The Heavens and the Earth, A Political History of the Space Age. I valued the Dexter Prize more, not only because it was awarded to me not by an anonymous committee, but by experts in the field of the history of technology, which I was kind of a poacher in. I'd just gone into it to research this book on the space race, and because the Dexter Prize came with a cash emolument of $2,000. The Pulitzer was only $1,000. Well, during that experience of researching my book on the history of the of Sputnik and the American response in the early space age, I came to appreciate tremendously the history of technology community. Academics in universities, but also in our various government history offices and museums, who have studied the history of technology almost invisibly to the country and to the academic community at large. The fact is, history of technology, I learned, was marginalized. It still is marginalized to an astonishing degree. It's rarely taught, despite its unbelievable importance for not only human history in general, but American history in particular. And it's surprising because of the very keen innate interest so many young Americans have in technology. It is the arena in which they live and move and have their being. Well, to address that marginalization, at least for a day, Lawrence Husick has conceived this seminar. And my final privilege is to introduce him, because he's one of the smartest people I've ever met, in every positive sense of the word smart. A graduate of Muhlenberg College and Washington College of Law, Husick pursues a long list of simultaneous careers, callings, and avocations. And I know just enough about patent law, since my father was a distinguished patent attorney, and I know just enough about technology and policy think tanks to appreciate his breathtaking productivity. As a lawyer, consultant, adjunct professor at Penn and Johns Hopkins, a business entrepreneur and inventor who holds several patents, and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And it's in that capacity that he co-directs the FPRI project, not only on teaching, he directs the project on teaching innovation, but he also is a keen participant in our Center on Terrorism and Counterterrorism. He is the Chief Innovation Officer, among other things, for TerraDisc, a pioneering company in silico drug research, and I hope that when and if that company goes public, that we all get advance notice. Please welcome Lawrence Husick.
Thank you, Walter, for those kind words, and good morning to all of you. This is going to be a day that is absolutely densely packed with wonderful information, wonderful stories and insights, and because of that, it's going to seem to move very, very quickly. So I'm going to kick it off without too many formalities because it's really important that we get to the real stars of this day, and those are the people with the actual stories to tell. I'm just here to set the stage. This program in teaching innovation really is a program in teaching history, teaching economics, teaching every other subject of human endeavor through a lens of innovation. Because after all, innovation is a lot of what drives human existence. When you think about innovation, it's important to distinguish it from invention, and most students do not. So let me give you a framework, and this is only one, for thinking about what innovation is. Innovation is the process of making changes. It's the verb. By introducing valuable new methods, ideas, products. But innovation is also the noun. It's the thing. It is the method, idea, or process itself. Now there's one word in this definition which I'd like you to focus on for the rest of the day. And that word is valuable. Valuable because without value, what we have is just something new, not something necessarily useful. Now, why do I focus on innovation? Why has FPRI, a foreign policy think tank, chosen to focus on it? Well, it's because we have a fairly sorry state of affairs today in education. And we have seen this at FPRI in talking to our elected leaders and policymakers about some of the most innovative people on the planet, those known as terrorists. It seems that people have a hard time understanding how they could be innovators. So let's talk about where we are today in education. The first problem, as I see it, is that we separate out students who are doing math and enjoying math, science, and technology far too early. By about third grade, we seem to have identified those who can do rigorous quantitative work and those who prefer the softer subjects. And from that point on, quite honestly, we let the soft subject kids slide. We don't demand that they stay on a track that will take them through calculus, that will take them through physics. Instead, we put them on an easier track. While we say to the kids who can and do science and math, yes, you'll also study Shakespeare. I haven't ever seen a course called Baby Shakespeare, but I've taught a course called Kitchen Chemistry. And I always wondered why that difference existed. The second problem is that our school systems teach students to fear failure. Now, often when they get into university settings, particularly in engineering and in the sciences, we have to unlearn that behavior because it's only through failure that we do learn, that we do advance. And any engineer will tell you the important thing is not failing, it's failing again. If at first you don't succeed, you won't succeed a whole bunch more times. That's what makes good engineers and scientists. But if a kid is so afraid of getting a B that he or she is paralyzed in that AP course, it's the wrong approach. And the result is that over the last 30 years, this country has failed to produce enough technologists and innovators to keep up with the world. Add to that, as we heard at FPRI this week, our failure to have an immigration policy that encourages the best and the brightest to come here and stay here from abroad, and we have a deficit that's just absolutely unbelievably difficult to deal with. So what are we doing? Well, at the Wachman Center at FPRI, we teach teachers because we think that's leverage. For every one of you here, there are probably 200 students you'll touch just this year. It's much simpler for us to do that than teaching students directly. We use innovation as a theme and give you the tools that you need to teach your subjects, regardless of time, place, or focus, but always thinking about innovation and what it brings to the table. And we have programs that are both live like this and on the web. Go to our website at fpri.org/education/innovation for a wealth of material from our conferences and from our scholars. We are supported by generous grants from Annenberg and Kaufman and Jerry Lenfest, among others. So the question, why helicopters? Why focus on helicopters? Well, part of that, I am proud to say, is just plain opportunism. You see, my law partner was a founder of this museum, and when he retired, I agreed to take his seat on the board, and I proudly serve here, and I figured, what the heck? But more than that, why not? Helicopters are cool. And kids know it. And that's an important way of engaging. So, for the rest of the day, some basic questions. Why a rotary wing? What you see out here is just wings that happen to move relative to the fuselage of the aircraft. Now, there were a lot of ideas early on about how wings might move. And probably all of you have seen the silent movies of the failed attempts to have airplanes that flap their wings like birds. And there were lots of good ideas like that, and lots of failures from which we eventually learned. The objectives, you've got to figure, are you want to take off vertically and land vertically, because then you don't need an airport. You can just land on top of a building. You can land wherever you wish. Secondly, you might be able to hover, and that could have real benefits. And third, you wanted something that was going to be safe, or at least safer. Now that's pretty strange when you consider that one definition of a helicopter is 200,000 independent parts desperately trying to get as far from each other as they possibly can. And yet the record of safety for helicopters is unbelievable, and safety is a tremendous, tremendous objective. But like anything else, the early history of helicopters was an invention that preceded a real need. That's Leonardo's drawing. Probably could never work for a lot of reasons that Dr. Charnov will tell you about in a few minutes. And even later on, early patents about how you might put together a helicopter just didn't pan out. We're still wondering about that, by the way. There's currently a prize competition underway for the first human-powered helicopter that can lift off and hover for 60 seconds. That's a lot of pedaling. So, you need to be able to recognize a need in order to have an innovation. And Igor Sikorsky, I think, perhaps said it best, if somewhat tongue-in-cheek. If a man is in need of a rescue, an airplane can come in and throw flowers. And that's just about all. But a direct lift aircraft, a helicopter, can save a life. And in fact, less than 5 years after Mr. Sikorsky first successfully flew the first controlled helicopter, that's what happened. November 29th, 1945, the first rescue at sea using a helicopter. A direct need, a direct value. Now, with all apologies to the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you need. Mr. Sikorsky, by the way, as well as Mr. Piasecki, who you'll hear about later, is famous for flying in a Homburg instead of a crash helmet. You can't get me to do one of those. But eventually, you find out that in addition to not always getting what you need, you don't really know what you want. Different ways of doing different things. Walk around this museum at lunch. You go from one generation to the next, evolving the technology as you go, until finally you figure out what you needed all along. And what you need is all of the things that a helicopter can do for us, for our society, for our economy. These are important kinds of machines. They let us do things. I doubt that Mr. Sikorsky would ever have conceived that a very important use of the helicopter was to follow O.J. Simpson in that white Bronco down the freeway in L.A. Or to have a powerful enough helicopter to dip into a lake, lift up tons of water, fly over a ridgeline, and drop it where a firefighter can't get at it. But those are just some of the things we do with these amazing machines. And so, as I said at the beginning, if you take invention and you add a value of some sort, what you get is innovation. What you get is the National Medal of Technology. What you get is something of lasting value. And we want you to be able to add your 2 cents and have your students add their 2 cents and carry on the conversation. And that's what this day is about. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first substantive speaker. Dr. Bruce Charnov is a man of many, many talents. He holds a doctorate, a law degree. He is an ordained rabbi. He is a professor at Hofstra University in the Frank G. Zarb School of Business. And he is, from my conversation with him, an absolutely incurable romantic about early flight. And with that brief and altogether unlaudable introduction, I give you Dr. Bruce Charnov.
Okay, get me up and running. Okay, while this is loading, I'm particularly excited because of where we are. Because except for the Sikorsky Enterprise in Connecticut, this is where the American rotary wing industry began, here in the Brandywine Valley. So we're here. This is your history. And hopefully it will be something that we can get excited about. It's a brief history. It got out of hand, my 358-page book that I wrote. You've got a copy of it. It has a lot more information that I'm going to be able to access today. I have a lot of slides because I've got a whole lot of work to do. It says brief, it's sort of not brief. Okay. This is cited by some historians as the first mention of rotary flight. It's from the 3rd century in China. Someone asked the master about the principles of mounting to dangerous heights and traveling to the vast inane. The master said some have made flying cars, and it's this, leather straps fastened to blades returning so as to set the machine in motion, fastened to returning blades so as to set the machine in motion. I have no idea what that means. And I'm not sure that anybody else does. It's a pretty fanciful way. But what we do know is that at that time in China, Chinese children played with a rotor on top of a stick. It would come to be, when it was reintroduced in Europe, it would come to be known as the Chinese top. This, which is sold in the gift shop. So we know that this thing did exist, and as I said, when it's reintroduced in Europe, it will be called the Chinese top. Sometimes this is also cited, and Bob Beggs and I have an argument about this. This is also cited as an example. This is from 1460 in Le Mans. It's the Virgin and Christ Child with Saint Benoit. This is cited as the first example of a helicopter. Unfortunately, there's some, and the conclusion is that it's right outside. You've got it, and you see it here. It's in the American Helicopter Museum. The problem is that there's some pretty solid scholarship by Eugene K. Liberatore, who wrote a book called Helicopters Before Helicopters, which, along with Jean Boulet's book, are the 2 major histories of this early helicopter history. He pretty conclusively demonstrates, it's also found here, you can look up here in the corner up here in this manuscript, this is from 1370. In fact, this is a Generette, it's a noisemaker. It never flew. What? He won't give up. I know it's his museum, he won't give up. But this is my presentation, and you're arguing with Eugene Liberatore, who maintains this was actually a noisemaker, it never flew. In fact, a more plausible beginning of helicopter history is the one that Lawrence referred to. This, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci. This is his helical screw or aerial screw. Leonardo's great insight was that air is like a fluid. And he was familiar with the Archimedes screw that we used to lift water. So he thought that conceiving of the air as a fluid, you could actually, if you could do this fast enough, you could in fact actually rise into the air. This is a modern artist's conception of that. The interesting thing is that it clearly shows, by the way, the Leonardo drawing was from 1483, it clearly shows that it was intended to carry a human being. Elect Jean-Pierre Paucton in 1768 will reintroduce this concept of an aerial screw into Europe. It's the first articulation of a rotary wing aircraft that would actually carry a human being. Before that, you didn't have, you had aerial craft that we're going to see, and we're going to talk about a lot of first, and a lot of stuff that looks insignificant until you realize, in fact, what it was. This is someone that almost nobody knows. This is Mikhail Vasilievich Lomonosov. He is considered the father of Russian science. He founded the University of Moscow. He was the first person in history to freeze mercury. He hypothesized the atmosphere of Venus. He speculated on the existence of Antarctica before it was known. And he wrote on the organic origins of amber and petroleum. He had a wide variety of interest. Again, he's considered the father of Russian science. He was also interested in meteorology. And his aviation contribution comes because of his interest in meteorology. He wanted something that could go up in the air and measure temperature. Before the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1754, this is what they said. The Honorable Advisor Lomonosov demonstrated his invention called the aerodynamic to be used for the purposes of depressing the air by means of wings rotating horizontally in the opposite direction by the agency of a spring type of used in clocks in order to lift the machine into the upper layers of the air. It was suspended from a string. It never actually flew. But there are two things from this. One is it's the first mechanical conception, at least, of something that could actually fly. And he clearly it looks like this is an artist recreation. Nobody quite knows what it looked like, but at least there's enough evidence to suggest that it was a coaxial, two propellers revolving in the opposite direction. The problem that you have is that when a rotor goes around, it creates centrifugal force. And one of the problems that we have is how do you counter that? And we're going to talk about that evolution. But the earliest evolution of how you do that is to have two propellers going in opposite directions. Otherwise, if you don't, it's going to tip over. As we're going to see, that will bother a great many people. This doesn't look like much. Not at all. This is the Lannoy Bienvenu helicopter. It's from 1783. It takes place after the first balloon flight, 1783 of the first, 1780 balloon flight. This is about a year later. It doesn't look like much. It is a bow with the twisted in opposite directions with, in effect, counter-rotating rotors on each end. And it was demonstrated in the French Academy on April 28, 1784, and it rose in free flight. It is the first powered aircraft to fly in history. And that's its significance. But it has a greater significance because it also inspires a ne'er-do-well English, minor English noble by the name of Sir George Cayley. Cayley will come to be known as the father of aerial navigation. He is inspired by the Lannoy Bienvenu helicopter. Of course, they didn't call it a helicopter. It would later come to be called that. But now we're rushing into really significant stuff. This is his version of it, and you can see he's clearly inspired by the earlier French helicopter. But he also observes nature, and this is a copy of a letter in which he writes about, down here at the bottom, he writes about observing a maple seed, how it spirals down, and it takes a long time to get to the Earth, and in fact it travels, I believe he says here, it travels over 70 feet. This phenomenon will come to be called autorotation. He is clearly aware of it. This, plus observing birds, sets him on an investigation of wings. And you can see here, this is from 1808, that he's done some pretty serious investigation about how wings work. And he does it in a very interesting manner. He constructs a wing, he puts it on an arm, that arm rotates around a cylinder, and it rotates because he puts a weight, and as the weight pulls down, it rotates. This is the founding of a science that today we call aeronautics. But he's what I like to think of as a pragmatic scientist. He actually goes out and he does kind of Roger Bacon type investigations. Cayley is the first one to, in fact, define the problems of rotary wing flight, actual flight in general. He speaks of lift, drag, weight, and thrust. And he's clearly aware of the relationship between thrust and weight. And he's aware of the whole issue of power. Now, this is his design. This is published in 1843. Your manuscript says 1943. He didn't live that long. It It was never built. It clearly would not have flown, but let's look at the arrangement. He's using, again, counter-rotating rotors, and he's got propellers here for forward thrust. Here he's looking at a canting of the rotor disc. It's very fanciful. It never would have worked, but it clearly shows that he understands the problems that he's got to face. Now, 13 years after Cayley's death, by the way, before he dies, about 4 years before he dies, he invents his version of the Chinese top. You put this in, you wound a string around it, you pulled it, and in fact would fly off. It's at this point this comes back into Europe, and it's dubbed the Chinese top. 13 years after he dies, and he dies in 1857, 13 years after he dies, this is the creation of a Frenchman named Alphonse Penot. Penot lives from 1850 to 1880. His little version flies. Now, of course, it's the same principle, but it's using a rubber band. And there are two things that come out of this. One is that he wants to build a bigger one, and he can't raise the money. At the age of 30, in 1880, he commits suicide, convinced he's been a failure. Little could he know that a version of the Penot helicopter that looked like this combination of the top rotor, you see that the bottom rotor is bowed, would in fact be given by a bishop in Ohio to his two sons. Milton Wright gave it to Orville and Wilbur. This is a drawing from a letter of Orville Wright where he, many years afterwards, he put this in a letter and he said, this was the toy that my father gave us. This is what inspired us to go into aviation. Now, we're jumping ahead to the 1860s. And in the 1860s, the hotbed of helicopter aviation was Paris. This is a very strange man. He is one of three that we're going to look at. He is known by the name of Nadar. It was the name that he chose because it was romantic. That, of course, was not his name. It was Gaspard Felix Tournichon. He is famous for a bunch of things. He is the first aerial photographer. And